Welcome to Martial Wisdom. Here you can listen to conversations on all kinds of topics related to martial arts. The topic for today's episode is what makes Aikido? Joining me in this conversation is Reg Sakamoto. Before we start, I want to share something I'm very excited to announce, and that is my Spirit Aikido online program now has over 200 videos in the library. In the most recent video set, I've released a series on the self-defense entry for Aikido practitioners. These entries use movements which every Aikido practitioner is familiar with. What I share in these videos is a way to apply them in a way that's very useful for self-defense. If you'd like to support the show, please consider subscribing to this online program. I know there's a lot of great content that you'll love to see. Another option is to contribute any amount you like through the PayPal tip jar. Even small contributions are greatly appreciated. I hope you enjoy this episode. Now, on with the discussion. All right, I'm very excited to welcome my friend Reg back to the podcast here, and we've got a very interesting topic today, which is what makes Aikido, or what is specific to Aikido. I started this as a kind of a poll to Aikido, the martial side, the forum, asking people, what do you connect with Aikido, or how do you define what is Aikido or what is not Aikido? What makes it Aikido to you? And I wanted to start by getting a list of people's ideas and concepts so that we could discuss them and kind of get a good discussion about, I guess, what defines Aikido. So welcome back, Reg. Appreciate you coming.
Thanks, Tristan. Thanks. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too. So as I started listing these out, and we're gonna cover every one of the comments. I've kind of grouped them into the concepts so we avoid the redundancy, but they seem to kind of come into two categories. In the first category, we're just picking this arbitrarily, it could be the first one or the second one, but is the physical differences between Aikido and other martial arts, whether they're Japanese martial arts or just other martial arts in general. How do I identify what makes Aikido? So you said you had a few thoughts. I'll let you lead off with your impressions of the differences of the physical differences of Aikido and other martial arts.
I mean, Aikido, in my opinion and in my experience, that Aikido is basically made up of nage-waza, kansetsu-waza, osai-waza. So throwing techniques, locking techniques, and pinning techniques. That's relatively what I believe makes Aikido. Other arts have throws and locks, but I think it's the riai, the logic of how Aikido works, that the entering and entering and turning, is, I think, what makes Aikido what Aikido is, as opposed to, say, jiu-jitsu or judo or karate.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, that's sure. It's very simple, but that's what I think.
Sure, and I think most people would identify Aikido being so strong in throwing. Judo does really great throwing as well. As well as the maneuvering, I think, is something that Aikido is very strong in taking up a strong position. Although you could also say Western wrestling has got a strong tradition of taking up a powerful position and proceeding with your standing grappling from there, specifically with like catch wrestling, as opposed to what we'd associate with like collegiate wrestling or
right.
Things like that. And I think you're right with the locks, because we do see those obviously in many other arts, Japanese and non-Japanese, of the joint locks and even in catch wrestling. I remember there was recently a discussion about kotegaeshi, and it's firmly believed by many that that's a very Aikido technique. But we do see it also in catch wrestling from Europe. And I don't think there was an influence of the Japanese arts on catch wrestling. There may have been, but I think it kind of came about on its own. And I'm inclined to believe that with almost all hand-to-hand combat, because the human body only works in certain ways, there are many cultures that found the vulnerabilities on their own without needing, okay, well, who came up with it first? Like,
no, exactly. I mean, we're other than geographical differences, I mean, all of us have the same body. Mm-hmm. And so we only got two, barring any disabilities or,
sure,
such, we all have 2 arms and 2 legs, and the joints all work in the same manner. I mean, it's not rocket science. People have been fighting for a long time. They figure it out, you know.
Exactly.
So,
And yeah, you know, we see different arts that have very similar techniques. In thinking about it, and I put quite a bit of mind work to this, I think there's only two techniques that I can envision that I've never seen anywhere except in Aikido that you could argue, I think could be argued are unique to Aikido. And that the first one I came up with or I thought of was Aikido's Toshinage. And the only reason that I say that you could argue that it's unique to Aikido is that the art that does hip throws the best, which in my opinion by far is judo, does not use a hip throw anywhere close to what Aikido's Koshinaga is.
right.
Nor have I seen any other art that sets up a hip throw like Aikido does. And I don't know exactly why that is. I have my own personal feelings on it, but what are your thoughts on Aikido's Koshinaga? I was trying to set up a whole podcast on Koshinaga just for this reason to kind of dig into it.
Wow.
But I've not seen that one
seen,
anywhere else.
Well, to my understanding, now, mind you, I haven't really looked at it. This is just from reading from one of Mr. Amder's books, Hidden in Plain Sight, and he talks quite a bit in that book about one of the aspects of Koshinaga. And there's this guy, Mr. Driscoll, that wrote a comparison of Aikido technique to Daito-ryu technique, and claimed that, relatively speaking, the only technique that Aikido has that Daito-ryu does not have is the Koshinaga. And I think they figured it came from Yagyu Shingan-ryu, so a jiu-jitsu school that apparently sets it up in the same way.
Okay.
Apparently. I don't know, as I don't do Yagyu Shingan-ryu, so I couldn't say, but
Sure.
that's what I've read anyway.
Yeah, and
and I think Mr. Amder, I'd take what he has to say pretty seriously.
Oh, absolutely, definitely.
Yeah.
You know, and as I looked at it, you know, it occurred to me, well, Morihei was dealing with a bunch of high-ranked judo practitioners. So I'm sure, you know, he felt, well, why would I need to teach any hip throws or show any hip throws? But he's also very much a improvisational type martial artist. So I can see, you know, him perhaps, I don't want to say setting it up, but just having an opportunity to move his hips in and throw with that sort of odd approach angle just out of a kind of a fluke. Because I mean, fighting is kind of like that. It's
well, absolutely it is. I mean, well, I think one of the things is that when you look, I don't think a lot of people take into consideration, but when you look at any Japanese martial art, from like classical jiu-jitsu to judo to Aikido to any of them, there was a time in Japan that everybody did sumo. And so they already had a background in how to take kazushi and how to throw with using a lot of their body. So I think there was already a stable center and a, you know, sense of a strong sense of gravity. So I think they already had skills that a lot of schools don't go over that material, because I think it used to be assumed knowledge.
Right.
But then as our modern world has moved on, that assumed knowledge doesn't exist anymore. And I think a lot of martial arts, I really think, were just like kind of more like refining schools.
Sure.
And they were like teaching from the ground up, in my opinion.
Yeah, you know, and I remember hearing that Rex Applegate, who put together the U.S. military's hand-to-hand combatives in World War II, encountered a similar thing when he was, you know, first thing he did was assess, okay, who am I getting coming, you know, who are these young recruits? And they tended to be, you know, usually young farm boys or you know, young men that came from usually, you know, poorer backgrounds. And he found that most of them knew how to do some basic grappling, because a lot of them had brothers, or they worked on a farm. They were strong. They could lift. They could, you know, they were physical. They knew basically how to punch. So he didn't have to write into his curriculum how to teach them how to do those things. So he started from where, you know, the baseline was. And I'm sure, you know, with having high-ranking judo students, that bar is pretty high. There's a lot you don't need to teach them.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they're already coming in with a really good a really good base knowledge. So
Yes.
you
Yeah.
just,
Not
there's
just
just a
not just
refining
physical
school.
like athleticism, but structure, application, technique, movement. You know, I think any instructor would realize that you take somebody like that in, they're a dream to teach, because they're so far along that you just need to kind of, you know, give them a few more things, as opposed to starting somebody who has no athletic or physical background.
Well, yeah, you can never discount someone's previous training. I mean, not to go on about myself in a sense, but one of my students here does a school called Takeuchi-ryu. It's one of the oldest combative jujitsu schools from the Warring States period.
Mhm.
And I said, "Oh, can I come and watch a class?" And he said, "Yeah, please come and watch." And so I went and watched it, and I met their headmaster, so the very head of their school. And I said, you know, is it possible, you know, may I watch the class? And he said, sure, you can watch it. He was very wary of me, you know, but that's pretty usual in traditional Japanese martial arts. When you visit a dojo, he knew I was coming. The permission was given, but when he would talk to me, he wouldn't actually look at me. And I could tell he was watching me out of the corner of his eye. And we were drinking tea before the class started. And one of the students came in and said, "Oh, who's this?" And I introduced myself, and he said, "Oh, he's here to watch the class." And the student said, "Oh, that's good. We hope you enjoy it." And then just before the class was going to start, he said, "Okay, so please join the class." And I was like, "Oh, okay." I hadn't brought a gi, I hadn't brought anything. And, "Oh, okay, sure, you know." So I jumped in and did the class, and it was a lot of fun. And my student had copied, because I'm not friends with him on Facebook, this teacher, but he had written up a whole thing about my visit and said that it was good for the other instructors to see somebody who could come in, see the technique once and do it. And he said it was good for the other instructors to see that there's people that have that kind of level. And so I think in the case of with Weishiba Morihei Sensei, or in a lot of cases, especially when you hear about guys that have trained in multiple schools, especially back before, they had a good sense of how to use their body, and I think they picked up really fast.
Sure.
So you would need to run over, you know,
Yeah.
here's how you take balance, you know.
Yeah, and
now you run
that's
over
a big
how
one
we
too.
take it.
The understanding of the importance of taking balance and what you can do with it once you have it. Like that's a pretty huge thing in the Japanese standing grappling arts. The second technique, just to jump to that I don't recall seeing or ever seeing a reference to, is the Iriminage Tenkan version, the Tenkan version of Iriminage, where you step in, turn, reverse, spin them around, and then take them down. I think that's about the only two that I can think of that are pretty, you can see the fingerprints of Aikido when you see those two techniques done.
Right. Right.
You know, and I think that one is pretty elaborate. It takes quite a bit of practice. What do they call it? The 20-year technique, the nickname of it, because it takes a while to really get down all the ingredients you need to make that thing reliably work.
Right.
And, you know, maybe it's, I guess, from a direct kind of fighting or violence standpoint, maybe a little bit more elaborate than would be used in a live type situation. Granted, you know, that said, I love practicing it. It's fun as anything to do. It's fun to be thrown with it. But boy, everything's got to be just right. It's kind of like a souffle. If it's in that oven a little too long, I think it'll just collapse.
Well, you know, I look at any techniques like that involve a lot of turning or spinning. And I think we in martial arts, especially in this current, sorry, I'm trying to think of English, current generation, that we look at it at a very face value. I look at something that involves me turning 180 to 360 degrees is, would I do that in a fight? Probably not. What am I doing when I practice something like that? I'm learning about 360-degree awareness. And I think a lot of times techniques are teaching you things like that, that on the surface, it looks like you're practicing the technique, but that's not, the technique is not the importance, but more of an understanding of having 360-degree awareness.
Sure.
You know,
absolutely.
and how to create a pivot point inside your body. You know, I think those are the things that become really important, as opposed to, would I do that? Well, would I do that? Well, probably not.
Mhm.
I've never done it,
Yeah.
but
Well, and as you do it, you can see that there would be a reason why you might, if you do get that position behind,
oh, for sure.
Uke's
Yeah.
shoulder, and depending on where you are in space or what you feel is behind you, and you need to turn the other direction, it could be the perfect solution. That's the thing about the chaos of fighting and combat. You can never plan out what could
Well, the
possibly,
variables are just
what
too.
won't. Yeah,
they're
there's so
too-
many variables. Even too many to set up in training. You can't even. That's why I like principles so much better. But
Well, absolutely. I mean, I always think that any school is always based off of its principles because I mean, the variables that exist inside, you can hypothesize them to death. You're never going to cover them all. So I
right.
always think it's better to have certain sets of principles that you work on, and
Mhm.
that's what you work on. If you find things in your school that don't exist that cover what you believe needed to be covered, for example, you think you need a good ground game, you want to do BJJ. I think there's nothing wrong. You should absolutely go and do that and cover the holes that you think exist. But I mean, the variables are too big. I mean, you can play the what if game forever, right?
Sure. Oh yeah.
It just gets
Um,
ridiculous.
yeah, and so I wanted to cover a few more of the physical ones that the aspects that people felt were I don't want to say unique to Aikido, because that's even, I think, overstating it, because many other arts have almost all the principles that Aikido tends to use. So they really aren't unique. And if anything, I find it distasteful when martial artists get into bickering about, well, this is part of my art and it's not part of your art, or my art had it first and your art copied it from my art, all that nonsense. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think it does pay to examine, like, what are the principles that Aikido uses as its strength, like, and so that's why I thought this would be a good kind of a mental exercise to go through. And one of the first ones that I really like, and this is something I've liked about Aikido all along, which is the scalability of the response, that you can use as much or as little to control a situation as you feel you need to, all the way up to, a level of 10, which is to pretty much destroy somebody, usually by using gravity as your ally and the earth as your fist, to completely immobilize somebody. And I'm not talking about pin them, but pretty much slam them hard enough that they don't want to get back up again. All the way down to gently setting somebody down. One of the things that I've loved to demonstrate is, for example, with an Iriminage, if I take someone down, I can cradle their head and gently set them on the ground like they were my daughter, if I had to, versus absolutely blasting their head to the ground. And so I do think that scalability response is something that is not necessarily unique to Aikido, but it certainly is a trait that I think Aikido has in spades.
It's a phenomenally great trait.
Yes.
One of the things that's talking about Iriminage or something like that is, I'll give a very quick story. When I was working in the hospital in Canada as security, and I remember that my go-to technique was, do you understand the Irimizuki?
Rimitsuki.
So Irimizuki, the one where you step in with the palm of the hand and hit under the jaw.
Oh, okay.
So
We
it's
call
not
that
like
one
an
shomanate,
Iriminage.
but yeah, I know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, I used to do this Irimizuki, but I had my own little twist to it because I used to do judo a long time ago. Was that I used to do a foot sweep at the same time as I would hit the jaw with the hand, and that was my go-to technique when I was a bouncer.
Mm-hmm.
That was my go-to technique in security. I used it all the time. One time, I did it, and I mean, and everything was justified on why I would use it.
Mm-hmm.
But I did it, and Buddy went completely upside down and came down really hard on the back of his head.
Ooh, yeah.
And he didn't wake up, and he went into a coma, and he was in the hospital I was working at because that's where he was. And the police division, that I knew them very, very well because they would bring patients to me all the time, and I dealt with people and I dealt with them a lot. They let me know if he didn't wake up that I was facing some pretty heavy charges.
Sure.
And luckily he did.
Mm-hmm.
And I will tell you that from that moment on, I never used that as my go-to technique again.
Sure.
Ever.
Yeah,
because
that foot sweep is a force multiplier, as if shomanate wasn't potent enough.
Absolutely. And that was, I thought, I dodged a bullet,
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, unless my life is completely in danger, where it's completely justifiable, it's just
Mm-hmm.
not worth it.
Right.
A manslaughter charge isn't worth it.
Yeah, that's
Really,
correct.
it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we could probably do a whole podcast on what you perceive as the threat to yourself versus what it actually is. With that
Yes.
adrenaline and with the everything that goes on. Yeah, that is a deep pool. But I do think, back to that scalability, that was probably one of the best responses, one of my favorites of all of the people that put that up, because I think absolutely true, all the way down to things like the joint locks and not only just the throws, but the controls, the pins, everything can be, as zingy as you need it to be, or as just gentle and compelling, yet compelling as it can be. So this was one of my favorites. One of the next one is they said the use of a temi and using one's own momentum to off balance them, as well as distance management, or ma'ai. It says also using irimi to enter into someone's space and induce a temi to put yourself in an ideal position to unbalance someone. This one, and I don't want to just sound critical, but I do think that you see that description, the use of striking and using momentum and entering space, in quite a few other arts. I know that certainly Aikido focuses on it, but that controlling of posture and balance is, I think it's a universal of just combat. Or hoplology. It's a fundamental.
Well, yeah, if you're not studying distancing, and timing,
Mm-hmm.
then you're not studying
Right.
for lack of a better word, a combative art.
Sure. Now, the particular angles that we use I think are a little more identifiable as Aikido when you see somebody practicing it. But if you take somebody, I think, out of a gi and out of hakama, and you simply look at their movement and their irimi, or their use of striking and use of momentum, it would be harder to identify them as Aikidoists.
I think we can identify it as Aikidoists in the simple fact, because generally, if we're talking about the angles, it generally comes shikaku, right? So the dead angle and the dead angle.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's, for myself, if I watch it, it's more identifiable by the posture.
Yeah.
Because, for example, Mike Tyson was a master. The Customato's,
Yes.
peekaboo style of
Mm-hmm.
just moving. He kept hitting the dead angles, and
Yep.
he even got a footwork down for it. And if you watch it, he's doing Aikido. If you
Yes,
want
absolutely.
to go that way.
It's funny you should mention that, because you start watching the feet and the approach angle, and you see the exact same ones that we often use.
100%, 100%. Same angles, same thing. Just he's not throwing; he's just punching.
Mm-hmm.
Which Mike Tyson. So just punching is a very interesting choice of words I use. But
Sure. Well, and as I understood it, the footwork was so potent that Tyson would often overstep a little bit, and when he came around to hit, he would actually hit in the back, which is illegal in boxing. So they actually had to cut his footwork short so that he could hit in the side, just behind, like basically where the kidney is, rather than coming in and hitting behind the head, the back of the head, or the back of the body. And to me, I mean, that's even better when you can slip that far around somebody. But for their boxing rules, they had to sort of trim it up a little bit.
well, it was beautiful when you heard D'Amato teaching him. I've
Yeah.
watched videos of him teaching, and he'd say, get to the outside of the shoulder. He says, what?
Mm-hmm.
He goes, he can't hit you with the other hand, and he has a difficult time to protect himself with this hand.
Right.
And you can open up on, floating ribs and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, wow, that's what we do in Aikido. It's just, it's not different.
The thing. To me, the more you see fundamentals shown in other arts, the more it's a universal fundamental. And of course, in any military parlance, you never want to engage a unit straight on. You want to go get to their flank or behind, and then that's where you hit them. And so I see that with these fundamentals that are elsewhere. Yes, we should not say, well, because it's not unique to Aikido, it's kind of a lackluster fundamental. I think the opposite. The more other people are doing it, the more it validates the principles that we're focused on. only when you get a principle that only applies to your art and it falls down and disintegrates when used elsewhere, do you have to question the validity of that fundamental, whatever it is.
Oh, absolutely agreed. Absolutely agreed. I mean, I think sometimes our perceptions are askew is because a lot of sporting, Olympic wrestling, judo, MMA, you know, when you have to engage somebody just head on to, you know, do what you have to do in the time limit that you have to do it in, you know, under the set of rules that you have to do it in. That's okay because it's a sport, and I mean you can learn a lot from all of that stuff, and they employ wonderful principles as well. But when you start getting away from like sport, you know, and for example, watch somebody from like Malaysia or the Philippines using a knife. I mean, they're never cutting at a person head on. You know, I mean, everything looks to put yourself in an excessively advantageous position where your opponent is in a very disadvantageous position.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that sport thing. One of my favorite examples is with Muay Thai, about how they like to use that head tie, where you got the opponent's head clamped in between your arms. And that is a great control. But what they removed was the ability of the person that's in the lock to body lock somebody, lift them up and slam them. That's illegal. It's also illegal to charge somebody and run them up against the ropes. Like you can't charge more than one step into that. So if you take away the counters to that I think they call it a head plumb or the Thai clinch, if you take away the natural counters to it, that clinch is going to dominate. So you know, it's a great clinch as long as the counters for it have been made illegal.
Well, I mean, the rules of things that you watch, I mean, the Olympics just finished up. I was very much into watching the judo aspect of it. Because it's their shoulders or their back is not supposed to touch. They will use their head to like keep their shoulders and back from touching the floor.
Oh,
so
sure.
They'll get thrown. They will intentionally throw themselves onto their head. And I'm like,
yeah,
okay, that's great because that's in your setting and that you're creating that as like a habit. God help you if you ever get thrown in life and you're on the street and you use your head. God help you, you know.
Exactly. You gotta adjust to your environment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So just to cover a few of the other physical traits, one of the ones mentioned was moving off the line of attack. I think this is just solid, you know, hopology 101. It's never good to be on the line of attack. Even if you've got the strength to withstand the strike you're about to get, it's better not to get it than to have to put up with it. One of them was dynamicism, which is to always be moving. I do think that this is a strength of Aikido. And many years ago, I heard that wrestlers would often say, you know, you Aikido guys are very hard to take down just because you're always moving around. And I even had that experience with my wrestler friend. You know, as long as I kept moving, it was hard for him to approach me. You know, I think that's the fundamental of a moving target. It's hard to hit, you know, flat out. That's just always the case. And it's better to be moving than to be standing still. And, you know, but I do think that, you know, a good boxer is always moving, you know, always slipping, always being evasive. I think there are quite a few. I don't think there's an art out there that says, yeah, don't bother moving around. Just sort of stand there and, you know, slug it out. Maybe you could make the argument that perhaps like Wing Chun does that because they've got their foot movement is so short and tight. But I don't think, and as I understand it, Wing Chun came from the Chinese city and type environment, urban environment, which is very tight on space. So it was really not built to be a take a lot of space moving around type of an art. It was meant to be short, explosive in a limited space type environment. So I mean, I certainly wouldn't blame it for that. But I think, you know, every art uses quite a bit of movement. I'm trying to think of one that doesn't. I'm not really coming up with much. You know, arm wrestling maybe, but it's not really a martial art.
Not much of a combative art there.
One comment was they said it was using a curved structure and not a straight arm, and this one is a little trickier. I think that this might be referring to posture. But with the straight arm, I don't know if that's considering like a locked arm, because I'm not sure of other arts that use a locked arm as much as a, like what we would consider an unbendable arm, or the arm that has its strong natural curve to it, because that's where you get the most strength,
Yes.
as opposed to locked. Yeah, I'm not sure if that one was elaborated on more than that. So that's kind of what I wrote in there. There's the scalable one again. Yeah, taking balance was one. And I think, like I said, judo has got the kazoosh part down. In fact, I really do think that judo is in many respects almost like a twin brother to Aikido. In that taking balance is everything with judo. And I'm sure there are other arts too, mostly anything with throwing a body. I mean, the idea of tipping somebody first to disrupt their ability to move and disrupt their strength, I think that's a solid fundamental, although certainly Aikido it's at the top of the list, kind of like judo. It's at the top of the list of important traits to that art, or to Aikido as well.
Well, I think any grappling art, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even sumo, for as large as those guys are, when they're shove somebody back out of the dohyo, it's not just a matter of straight muscular into, well, they have a lot of muscle, but it's not, it's more a matter of tipping the person's hips up so they can't get their feet. And think sometimes Kazushi is not as good. Kazushi is not as easy to see.
Right.
You know, and it's not so obvious. And especially if your opponent isn't aware that they've lost their stability, that's a very advantageous place for you to be at.
It definitely is. Yep. And it takes a very experienced touch to be deceitful and take their balance in such a way that they don't think it's been taken. To me, that's kind of like the pinnacle of the art of taking somebody's balance. If you can do that, you really have got a high level of skill, much less do it reliably. And I mean, that's what we're always shooting for, is to have that level of subtlety and skill. You know, that it's always that ring that's just a little bit beyond the grasp. You always keep reaching for it.
Absolutely.
A couple of the other ones that was mentioned. One was heavy hands and then weight forward. I think the hands would be a little easier to accept, was more of a Aikido specific trait than weight forward. I think that weight forward, and I'm not sure exactly what they meant by this weight forward, but you could also view this as kind of like the athletic stance. When somebody drops their hips, put the hips back a little bit, chest is a little bit forward. You imagine like a shortstop waiting for the batter to hit the ball, and he can run in any direction. That kind of that readiness thing.
Right.
I think the weight forward that he was talking about was probably that ready stance. And I think that's like a universal for just athletic readiness to move anywhere. Knees are bent, center's lowered just a little bit, you know, chin is up, eyes are forward. You know, and of course that stance is modified for somebody like a wrestler who needs a lower center of balance. They take the whole thing and they lower it to more of a crouch. But, you know, the heavy hands, I think is, and I'm not sure exactly what they meant by heavy hands, but I can kind of guess where you want to contact with uke, you want to kind of stick to them, and you want to add a little bit of weight to them to make their movement a little bit more difficult and give their brain a little bit of input as to that their movement is being hindered a little bit.
Right.
That's totally my interpretation of what they wrote, though. But those were a couple interesting ones too. What is your view on the contact and the stickiness and the weight through the hands?
I think everything is really such a case by case sort of scenario.
Sure.
I think that, I mean, I'm a pretty large individual, and I have a certain, some people might call it personality flaws. Anyway, I have a certain temperamental makeup. I've learned, especially in refining what I do, I've learned that a surgeon's scalpel is a lot more useful than a sledgehammer. Although from time to time a sledgehammer can be useful,
Absolutely. Yep.
And I think sensitivity, and especially if dealing with weaponry, and it's one of the whether the, for example, tachidori, so like sword taking, or jodori or tantodori or anything, whether it's realistic or not realistic, I think the concept of sensitivity in weapons is excessively important, and to feel somebody and stick to them in a way that lets you read what's going through. So going through their body will give you a lot more time to react. I mean, I don't like the concept of reaction. I believe that everything should be action as opposed to reaction, but I think sensitivity is really important. The most important thing that needs to be developed. I used to always say, especially when I bounced, I've got a pretty good chin, and I've had a few guys. I mean, I'm from Canada, and we have a lot of hockey players, and I don't know if you're aware of the sport called hockey, but they like to fight.
Well, I'm from Minnesota, so yeah, we're pretty familiar with the hockey thing.
Yes, you are. So they like to fight.
Yes, they do.
And one of the things is that you could always be sure they were gonna like grab a hold of your shirt and just bust you one right in the mouth.
Yep.
And I used to never worry about it, and because I could take a shot. So I was young, I was stupid, and I let them. Yep. And then I thought about it one day, and I thought, wait a minute, Reg, what if that's not a punch? What if he's got a knife? You know what I mean? Do you really want to stand there and, what are you going to take a knife? Like, no. Right. Which is when I started to convince myself that I needed to move more.
Sure.
That whether you can take it was not an option.
Yep. That whole, get off the line. That's a great concept.
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. You see,
nobody likes going
I never
to the
saved
dentist.
my face. That's why you got this ugly visage in front of you now.
Oh, too hilarious. I think one of the last ones is the awase, or the matching part, and this I think is probably one of the stronger traits that people that I often identify with Aikido. The idea that you're matching movement with an attacker in such a way to avoid the collision, and I do think you see that quite a bit in jiu-jitsu, whether it's the ground jiu-jitsu or the standing jiu-jitsu, which is sadly a lot of times forgotten in the wave of the Brazilians kind of coming in and claiming jiu-jitsu from the ground side. But the idea that you're using you're matching your attacker's motion in such a way that you can come in and control without needing to collide. I do think that is a pretty strong Aikido trait. Would you agree?
Right. Yeah, but it's in a lot of other arts that some arts that I've done, or that I do, not done, do.
Yep.
Even for example, with the spear. We're always taught. So depending on what someone means by matching. So I'm not sure what someone's dictionary for matching means. My dictionary for matching, for example, in this case of Aikido, or in the case of Hozoin spear, is from a poem written by Kichi Hogen, who was alive in the 12th century, who wrote about, 2 + 8 = 10, 1 + 9 = 10, 5 + 5 = 10. In all cases that one needs to match. I'm really paraphrased,
Sure.
but in the numerology of it, I mean, if someone uses a lot of force, I mean, for example, with the spear, when I use a kamayari, so the cross spear against the straight spear, you have to feel if you have a weaker partner when they thrust at you, you can take that, and you have to, because maybe they don't have a lot of strength, not a lot of focus in the end of their spear, and to make the technique work properly, you need to add more oomph to it to get it to snap down the way it needs to snap down. Otherwise, it looks like 2-3 meter long wet noodles, right?
Right.
But when you face somebody that comes in really focused and has a lot of focus in the end of that spear, and they go to stab at you, and you catch it, and you can be a lot more gentle, is maybe not the right word, soft,
Sure.
and get exactly the same effect, because then it's more of like a whip, like a whipping sensation, right?
Using more efficiency than strength.
Right. So I think I view Aikido the same way. I mean, when you're dealing with somebody and matching, I think matching is depending on the amount of power that's coming, or the speed, or do I want to match it? And I don't want to match it. And again, that I don't know what that person's dictionary of matching is. Right. I'm only thinking my own personal dictionary of matching. For me, matching, if it comes to speed or power, is that I want to overextend you. So if I match you, is I want to match your timing, but I want to move it with the distance and the timing in such a way as to overextend you.
Sure. And, this is one of those things where, we get drawn into the rabbit hole of Japanese terms that mean a ton of different things, and they don't ever seem to mean the same thing to two different people. So, I did a bit of digging into what that awase means, and I got caught down a rabbit hole. there was not a general agreed upon, here's what it means, and here's only what it means. There was always 2 or 3 more descriptions and definitions that weren't quite related, but I mean, it's dizzying to try to keep track of this stuff.
Well, because it depends on the school, right? So they will pick a character. So awase, and when they write it out, it depends on the logic of their entire school of what that means. For example, I think Mr. Amder wrote about in a couple of even one of his schools that Aiki was something to be avoided.
Okay. Well, yeah, and I want to know by what definition. So what does Aiki mean? I mean, that could be a whole nother episode of.
Well, absolutely. But when he wrote about it in his book, Hidden in Plain Sight, he was talking that, Aiki was something to be avoided. In a couple of other schools, that's their writing. So there you have, again, one of those things that here's the word, here's the term, but every school has their own take on it. And I think it makes it very difficult to understand.
Sure.
Completely, especially to translate it to English.
Yeah.
Makes it hard.
Yep. Exactly. And I do think that judo has a lot of that matching motion, connecting, using momentum, as well as
push,
fighting it,
push.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, any grappling art really has that when done at a high level. And this is where I think it pays to identify the difference between, for example, young, extremely powerful athletes doing judo, and then seeing somebody who has, 20, 30 years worth of judo behind them, and about how they are subtle and cunning, and they're not just powerfully trying to throw people around with athletics. They're actually using angles and movement and subtle, cunning approaches and that sort of thing.
Well, I think the problem, for example, with Olympic judo, not that it's not a problem per se, but one of the things that I think makes it difficult to watch and understand is that you have a time frame to work in, and that's why I liked it better when it was just a concept of ippon judo, because now with these, like, you have so many fouls and I have so many less fouls, so therefore you win. There's like a strategy involved in it that I don't really like. But the other problem is that you have two, relatively speaking, I mean, they're exactly the same weight category, same weight, that you have two really skilled, balanced individuals that know what you're going to try to do. Right. So it's really hard to take their balance. Yeah. And I think that's where the strength factor starts coming in, because just the subtlety just can't happen, because the person completely knows what you're trying to do. They know what the technique is you're trying to set up,
Right. Yep. Yeah, definitely. The last one I want to cover from the physical side, and this is going to kind of bridge us into the next topic, and I think that is ki, the use of ki. Now, again, here we get into the same problem as awase. Is like, okay, well, what definition of ki are we talking about here? And I got to finding a definition that I thought was pretty solid although I'm sure it would generate argument about whether or not this would fit or not. But that is the physiological mechanics for receiving, processing, and applying force. And the reason I like this one was that it tends to stay away from the mystical or this almost supernatural or the obscure. It tends to focus on ki as being your body, your ability of your body to internally orient itself and work in the most efficient manner for what it's faced on doing. And that might be whether you're connecting and delivering force, might be whether you are in contact with somebody and you can perceive force that's being used against you, and then you can orient your body in such a way that it does not allow it to face that collision. Again, I'm sure this could be a whole episode in of itself of like, what is a decent general definition of ki?
Never find one, but I like that. I
Yeah.
like the one you just gave. That's really cool.
I'm a pretty practical and pragmatic person, so I tend to avoid stuff that's too woo-woo. You know, tell me what this is. That because if you can't do that, then we can't really get on to transferring the skill. You can't absorb something you can't understand. And so I try to avoid that with my students and say, all right, this kind of, for example, the unbendable arm, which to me a lot of times looks like a parlor trick. I don't think it is. I think it is just merely a way of getting somebody's brain and their body to interact together to get the most efficiency out of their body. It seems like you're tapping into some kind of magical strength, but you're not. It's just how your body uses its muscles in a more efficient way. It gives me the EBGBs when I hear these weird descriptions of what ki is and things like that. And of course, although Aikido does not do this, it's seen in other arts where they'll talk about, you know, using ki to levitate, or using ki to heal yourself, or using ki to throw energy balls or whatever. You know, unfortunately, that's kind of where there are susceptible minds out there that can buy into that kind of thing. So I think that's just a bad place to go as a teacher or as an instructor, to try to, you know, make it something more than what it is. But as for what it is, you know, I don't speak Japanese, so I couldn't tell you what it means.
I don't think I do speak Japanese,
mm-hmm.
and I live here, and they mention ki all the time. Like, how is your ki?
Mm-hmm.
So, how are you is just genki desu ka? You know,
okay.
How are you? So how is your original ki?
Mm-hmm.
The tenki, weather, heavens ki.
Sure.
You know, but it's used linguistically in Japanese. It's used a lot. I don't think if you ask any one person in Japan, what is ki? I mean, I'm a Yoshinkan Aikido guy, and one of the jokes is that someone asked at the Yoshinkan Honbu Dojo to Chida Sensei, who's one of our really big Shihan, he's very, very, very iconically talented man. They asked him about ki, and he grabbed the locker key, and he said ki.
Yep. Nice. Nice.
Here's ki.
Yeah. You know, and I think there's definitely something to for the idea that ki might be reflective in a word like attitude, or where your spirit is. Is your spirit disturbed? Is it sound? Is it solid? Is it positive? Is it upset? You know, I do find it funny that typically the English speaking world has used the word energy as its kind of general equivalent to what ki is, because nobody understands what energy is either. You know, and if you talk to a physicist, they'll say, well, what is electricity? Well, electricity is energy. Well, what does energy mean? It just means, you know, molecules traveling from A to B, from negative to positive. Well, what exactly is that? Well, they can't really define it, but energy is as good enough a word as any to say there's energy going through that copper wire, you know, or electricity. But it is kind of funny that even in English, we have a word that has a whole lot of different meanings that aren't exactly understandable. I mean, you can, when you talk about energy, you know, if you know, stick your tongue on a, you know, a live wire, there's something there. It's powerful, but I don't think it's something that people viscerally relate to. and they're not really sure, like, is your energy up? Does that mean is your vitality up, or is your attitude up, or your emotional state, is it diminished, or are you feeling energetic? All those types of things. I think you take that confusion, and then with ki, it's like 10 times more. And then you add on to the, well, if you're not Japanese, you can't understand Japanese language anyway, so just don't even bother. But it's funny
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, as I say, funny to hear you say you live there, you're native to it, and it means different things, and there's not really
nobody could ever agree on, like, I don't think anybody here in Japan, they don't really think about it. I mean,
right.
I don't know everybody, obviously. I'm just talking about general. I don't think they really, as I said, there's various ways that they use the word, but I don't think if you ask them to really, like, specifically say what's ki, they'd probably, I mean, unless you went to, like, a traditional medicine, like dealing with acupuncture and
sure.
Traditional medicines like roundup roots and stuff like that, like, they would have a take on it, but that's also then derived from, like, the Chinese sources on ki.
Sure.
So yeah, that's a gigantic rabbit hole.
It is, and it seems like as Aikido spread through the world, the rest of the world kind of grabbed the bone and ran with it, and it probably took it far beyond where it was ever meant to be in terms of defining or describing what was going on there. But I do think if there was one thing that come away with ki that I also like, not just from the physiological, the internal aspect, but also the emotional or attitude aspect. And in so many different philosophies and whatnot, the attitude that you have and the perspective you bring in means the world about how you interact with your environment, the other people that are there, and the impression you leave from your presence. I do like the mat for, you can really tell what somebody's about when you train with them and you see how they interact on the mat. You can tell when somebody's got a positive attitude towards learning, or they've got a little bit of out of control ego, or they feel like they're there to prove themselves to everybody, or whatever. So I do think there's something to, I guess, ki, if you would translate that to spirit or what have you.
I've always, for myself, in a sense of a martial sense, not in a sense of your health or the weather or anything else, I've always looked at it as, command presence, and then your tone. So when you're, like, conversing with people, so therefore, tone, cadence, how do you use it, like when you're speaking with people, and then gaze, how you look at somebody, but that's also part of command presence, right? So
sure.
That's how I always personally sort of looked at ki.
That aspect of ki, absolutely. Well, and this brings us kind of to the other category, away from the physical and into the other traits that Aikido has that a lot of people relate to. Now, one of the most popular ones in this category being the de-escalation or avoidance of violence. And I do think that that's a trait that is often related to Aikido, at least as the general perception. And I do think that this is probably the biggest gap between Aikido practitioners and other martial artists. Of all the martial artists I've ever met or talked to, 99% of them have no interest in actually getting into violence. They would rather avoid it. They know how dangerous it is. They appreciate that. They don't want to be a dick. They don't want to get into a fight. Even if they know that they can win one, they just don't want to go there. They don't want to be in a police station overnight. They don't want to send somebody to the hospital, much less be in the next bed with them. They know a lot of these things. And I think if anything, this is something that the Aikido community can be a little bit arrogant about, thinking that it is somehow morally superior to other martial artists because they have this quote unquote trait. But if there was one I think we share with almost all martial artists, it's this one. We don't want to have it.
Absolutely, 100% agree.
And we want to avoid it. And granted, there's some exceptions, usually young bucks that are not very experienced that want to go out and, get into fights. But, I think they're in the extreme minority. You cannot paint any martial sport, any martial art with a broad brush saying they're a bunch of knuckle drugging goons that want to go get in fights.
No.
Maybe
I
you could
agree.
describe that of the military, young men who've been put through boot camp, they've been given, raw iron to chew on and been made miserable. And they've been trained to go out and just deal as much damage as humanly possible. Maybe for those guys, you could make that argument, but I'd say most.
Well, that's military. That's not martial. That's
right. Exactly. I mean, you could say it's military martial art, but those guys are trained for combat. They're like, it's a different type of thing than civilian trained martial artists.
Yes.
So,
well, the rules of engagement are different.
Right.
And that's a really important thing. So therefore the mindset is different,
Mm-hmm. Yep. Now the person who posted this said, if that fails, being the de-escalation, a swift response to reduce or mitigate damage, injuries to both aggressor and defender. I would say that the swift response to reduce the damage to the defender would be universal to all arts. Everybody wants to end a fight, and they want to survive unscathed if possible. Where it would differ would be to mitigate the damage to the aggressor. I would say that not many martial arts have a whole lot of consideration for the attacker. And maybe that this is the best argument that Aikido does try to protect the aggressor, but I find that that's more in the individual attitude of the person defending. And that is circumstantial. I mean, there are some, and this is hard to paint this as a broad brush. Like, would everybody who gets attacked viciously be that kind to their aggressor? I don't know. I just can't. I can't say. I wouldn't be of myself in picturing, dealing with somebody who really earnestly wants to rip my head off. How far I would go to protect them from, themselves, really, because all Aikido really do is we set up to make it very easy for somebody to fall. But
I'll tell you right now, Tristan, I wouldn't. I would not worry about protecting my I would worry about until the threat stopped. And if the threat stopped meant me disengaging myself to get away, then that's actually my due diligence. Then that's fine.
Right.
But if it's in the case of protecting somebody else, until the threat stops.
Right.
And I'm not going to say by whatever means necessary. I mean, law is always something that's going to, going to take precedence, right? And you have to discern in the moment if that's something that, well, your actions, are you willing to accept the consequences of said actions, right? So, what I like, and we talked about in the other time we talked together, that for me was useful in that sense of Aikido is dealing with a 6'3", 215-pound guy on PCP, and dealing with a 98-year-old grandmother in a wheelchair who's got dementia and trying to hit you. That's, I think, where the choices come in,
right?
Of use of force, But I think if one takes the time to think of, I'm going to look after the aggressor, if that's a person who really means to cause you harm, that's not a good headset to be in my opinion.
I would tend to agree. And I mean, unless you can see that you have a clear advantage in the disparity of force. But at that point, what do you really need a ton of martial art training to do if you've got size, strength, athleticism on your side, or they're not very skilled, what have you. But you're right, absolutely right. In fact, there's really that kind of that wiggle room area in there of, are you sure that what you do to somebody, the technique that you apply, is going to save you and protect you in the next 10 seconds, not just in the next 2 seconds. You may only have one shot to put somebody down and to halt them from their assault on you. And that includes halting their will to assault you, not just their physical ability to assault you. Could be a balance of both of those. And that, I don't think there is an exact right answer, but if you had to err, do you err on the side of maybe not finishing the job, or do you do a little bit farther than you need to make sure that this threat is over? And I mean, there's so many variables and considerations. You know, is your family there? Are there innocent people there? Is there a weapon involved? Is there, you know, you couldn't end the list of counting how many different factors are at play.
Oh yeah, the variables are just huge,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. But I think that when it comes to safety, of course, we don't want to turn ourselves into vengeance either by, you know, taking, you know, causing damage beyond the time where the immediate safety is no longer in jeopardy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that actually
that's our responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
when the threat is stopped, that's where you need to stop. A friend of mine, he's a Slavic guy.
Mm-hmm.
He's from Poland, and we used to work security together for years. He's one of I refer to him as a brother. He sent me a video, and I won't get too graphic, but he sent me a video from Serbia of this guy that was pummeling this other guy on the ground. People came to stop him because the other guy was unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
People came to stop him. He got up and put a finger in their face and told them to like back off, went back to pummeling him, turned the guy over, and proceeded to break both of his arms.
Wow. Okay.
And I looked at that and I said, and when I say I laugh, I would like you or any listener to understand, it's not that I think that doing something like that to somebody is funny.
Mm-hmm.
Don't misunderstand when I say I laugh. When I laugh with him is that I said, now you see, my friend, that's the difference in North America. A lot of people think that violence is someone's just going to punch you in the mouth and like, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
I said, there are places in the world and there are people in the world that think that that's a reasonable thing to do to somebody.
Right. Well, and
if you think
getting deep into violence, I mean, I'm sure, you know, it was a video clip. It was probably pretty short, but more than likely there was no idea like what was the history between these two guys. You know, who really started.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, nothing set,
like
nothing
you get another whole rabbit hole of, you know, and why violence exists. It's not random and as haphazard as people think. Usually when there's violence, it's for a reason. You may not understand or comprehend the reason, but a couple of broken arms usually is a message of you've messed with somebody or something that you should never mess with again. And this is a reminder.
But
yeah,
that's why I like you, because when I watched it, I said, you know, I reserve judgment. I don't know what led up to this situation,
right.
But from me watching it, it was all of like a 26-second clip. I said, for me, what? I have a feeling that man probably put his hands on something or someone that he was not supposed to,
right.
And that this was a message. And my buddy said to me, he said, as a Slavic person, I will tell you that absolutely that's a message.
Sure.
Of either child molestation or rape, or like, do not put your hands where they don't belong.
This will be the last time, and you're going to remember this for the rest of your life, and not just getting knocked out or having your face, you know, pulverized a bit, but, you know, 2 broken arms that will be a long reminder. So
yes.
Yeah, and that actually gets us to, I think, a great lead into probably the big one in terms of what is a unique trait to Aikido, and that is the implied morality or the spiritual development aspect of the martial art. You could say that there's an ethical dimension to it, and I really have a hard time pinning this down because it's so different for so many different people of what it means to study Aikido from a spiritual standpoint or moral standpoint or philosophical. And I wonder if this door was opened by Morihei himself, who was a devoutly religious man, at least in terms of what he wrote and what he spoke, although his actions seem to be a little bit different than his words. But the words themselves resonate with a lot of people in terms of it being some kind of a spiritual enlightenment that they are studying Aikido for. What are your thoughts on this aspect of the study of Aikido?
Do you really want my thoughts on that?
I do. I want you to lay it out. Let's hear it.
You know, well, first of all, I'm going to start with if you've never had the chance, go to IKWeb, and Peter Goldsberry's got a thing called inheritance or transmission, inheritance, and emulation, something like that. It's really, 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 really long. I haven't quite finished it yet. I mean, it's like 28 blogs, but they're like really long. It's. Do you know who Mr. Peter Goldsberry is?
I've heard the name, but I've never met him.
He used to be the chairman of the International Aikido from Aikikai Hombu Dojo.
Yeah, he's quite famous. Yeah.
Yes, and he runs a dojo in Hiroshima here in Japan. He's lived here for the past 35 years or so. Speaks, reads, and writes Japanese excessively fluently. He's a Harvard-educated man. He's a university professor at the University of Hiroshima. Anyway, I mean, even he writes about in there, and I suggest to anybody, if they take the time, please read it. It's phenomenal. It's long, and some parts are a bit of a slog to get through, especially it's got a lot of Japanese in it, but it's definitely worth the read. The message, I think, or even not I think, that even Mr. Goldsberg has put out there is that a lot of the message of Ueshiba Sensei got changed after the war, and it wasn't changed by him. It was changed by the son.
I've heard
and
that.
And then a lot of what's been translated into English is what has been the message that wanted to be put forth by the son.
Sure.
And the issues, or even is brought up in there, is, and Mr. Amdur has written about this as well, that Japan after the Second World War was in a really bad place. I mean, bombed out and poor and starvation, and it was in a really, really bad. Nobody wanted to think about war. So a way to popularize something was to talk about peace. So
kind of as a marketing tool.
Yes. So what they talk about is not, when they take the words of Ueshiba Morihei Sensei, it was not what he said, or even in the context of what he said. And there are some parts that have been translated where there's like entire huge amounts of chapters and sections that have just been left out that were critical to understanding what went into the entire process.
Sure.
Now, I'm not going to argue with anybody about the whole concept of what did Ueshiba Morihei Sensei say, what did he not say, what did he mean, what did he not mean. I will bring one point, is that someone apparently, when Mr. Amdur was sitting in a meeting with Kishimaru and the other Aikikai people and all these foreign delegates, someone asked Kishimaru, when did your father become a pacifist? And he had to have it translated to him several times. And when he finally understood what he meant, he started laughing. And Mr. Amdur said it's the first time he ever saw him laugh. And he said, my father was not a pacifist.
That was a very enlightening thing to read years ago when I first came across it. And to me, it's sort of that push pin point of coming back to, is Aikido a pacifist art or is it not? To me,
I don't think
that one story basically encapsulates no, it's not. And it wasn't, it wasn't meant to be. I think it's evolved into it,
it has
subsequently, but not because that was ever part of the design or part of the intent. In fact, I don't think you really could have a pacifist martial art. I think the idea is
I don't think so
kind of
either.
Preposterous.
Yes, it is. And don't get me wrong. I think that what Kishimaru did to propagate Aikido in lots of different fields and ways that never would have been touched by Morihei Sensei is a good thing. And I think that it's got a lot to offer people. And if people want to get involved with it, to pursue, to make themselves a better person, that's great. And the world is a violent place. And do we really need more violent people? No, we don't.
Right.
Here's my issue, though. And a lot of Japanese Budo always talk about it with this Ningen Keisei no Michi, which is basically the proper how to be a good person, or the proper path to becoming a better person. I've done martial arts. Okay, I'm 51, so I've done martial arts for 45 years, and various martial arts, and I still currently do various martial arts. I have never, ever, 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 ever seen that. I believe how martial arts can make you a good person is you were already a good person. It just made you a bit of a better person. gave you some choices, gave you some, maybe you were gonna like go down this kind of path, but you chose to train in the dojo, and it gave you more positive energy to move towards a more positive path. I like to think that's what happened for myself.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I think I would probably ended up in jail or something. Uh, if you're, and I say the C word,
Yes.
if you're a cunt, studying martial arts is going to make you a bigger cunt, eh?
Yeah.
I have seen people at the top that are just such dicks and full of ego and lecherous and horrific people. Martial arts did not make them a better person, especially not Aikido. It gave them a bigger platform to
Mm-hmm.
be a bigger cunt.
I would have to agree.
So I do not believe, and I apologize to anybody who's offended by that word. I am sorry. I spelled it with a K, so don't worry. It's I just don't believe it. I don't believe that in any of the I think the spirituality, if it works for you, you are already personally inclined that way. It makes you a better person. 100,000%. I applaud you. I think that's excellent. And the world needs more people like that, because the world is a violent, sick place. And the more people that we can have that are looking towards a harmonious, whatever that means,
Mm-hmm.
loving, peaceful place, well, that's great. But I don't think the art itself will do it. I really don't.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you. In fact, as you described that, something came to mind, and this was back when I was really into Bruce Lee and the message about Chinese philosophy that he wanted to bring to his films and he wanted to show to the world. And there was one part in there that I really, really liked, and that was, they said that when they're talking about the virtue of strength, or you could use the term prowess, the ability to have the power to control or the power to protect. And that is, they said, you talk about all the virtues. You talk about honesty, integrity, gravitas, piousness, all of the different good virtues. The one that allows all those virtues to live and to survive is strength. Without strength, those virtues will be lost to somebody else without them, who can come along and overpower you. And that, I think that resonated really true with me to reinforce your point about, you can be a good person, earnest, honest, good in every way. But if you are weak, you can be eliminated very quickly, if not instantly, by somebody who merely has strength. They don't have any of those other good qualities, generosity, kindness, none of it. They can, with their strength, they can overwhelm you. So the idea that strength is the virtue by which all of the other virtues can survive was, to me, the link together with that philosophy and that spirituality, that strength that you build through training of your martial art allows you to protect and keep your other positive virtues going into the future, and that they will not be snuffed out merely by running across some savage. So I like that in terms of, but that's not really part of the training itself. It's merely your attitude of how you approach your training and what it does to fulfill that one side of you, because it is only one side. And I do think that, even going back to Plato, who was, as I understand it, a very powerful wrestler and very, very physical, but yet wanted to build his intellectual side as much as he built his physical side. And if I remember right, it was Socrates or Aristotle. They talked about, the perfect man being not just the intellectual or not just the warrior, but the combination that made the ultimate person, the fulfilled human being. And that's, I guess, just one way to look at the philosophy or the spiritual side of how martial arts fits into it. But I agree with you. I don't think merely the study of Aikido as a physical art provides any avenue to some kind of spiritual enlightenment. Although that flavor is there in some of the realms of Aikido, some dojos and groups have a very strong influence of it, but I think it tends to be more within the ritual aspect of kind of the atmosphere.
Right.
But I'm often disappointed and kind of turned off when people are more interested in practicing rituals and studying protocol than they are getting on the mat and actually training, because that's what physical training is for. And as much as I love philosophy and spiritual development, talking about morality, and I love that stuff to death, but not on the mat.
I think it's something that can be done in a coffee shop after a practice, or in a bar after a practice. It's not something that needs to be expounded on during a time that sweat should be flying.
Right. Exactly.
In my opinion.
And I do find that when I'm teaching, I'll explain kind of what we talked about, like the scalability of response. That has a lot to do with your judgment of what you think needs to happen at in a certain moment. But as a teacher, I can't impart that judgment. That judgment will always be up to you, the student. It's your ass, buddy. If you put somebody in.
Well, when rubber hits the road, unfortunately, it's you're the one that's dealing it.
Exactly. And I can't tell you what's right or wrong ahead of the game. All I can do is give you the tools, and then open your mind to some of the considerations that you should be looking for. But the judgment is ultimately up to the person in the heat of battle. I mean, that's just my view on it. But
and hopefully one has trained one students to a point that your student is able to make good decisions in those moments.
Right. Exactly. And it always kind of creeps me out a little bit when I see instructors, and there's not a ton of them, but there are out there that are dealing out what they'll tell everybody what's right and wrong, what they should or shouldn't do, how they should or shouldn't. It's like there's always the EBGBs with messages.
I don't like the moral police.
It's tough enough to deal with on your own, to realize that you have ultimate say in your judgment, without having it clouded by somebody else whose skin is not in the game. It's not his butt that has to pay for your own decisions. It's you.
That's right.
I think, what is that phrase? Always be wary of someone's opinion when they don't have anything to lose by having a bad opinion. It's if you're the one that's going to lose it, you better think it through. So, but I do think that Aikido is probably one of the worst offenders of martial arts that have this spiritual, moral, philosophical overtone to everything that it does. And again,
I think it depends on the dojo.
It does. It's not totally universal, but it's widely known for having a bit of arrogance in the, we're more moral.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I read a lot of comments from a lot of Aikido people, and I'm always like, wow, that's called spiritual masturbation, buddy. You must be enjoying yourself there.
Yeah.
But I've never in Yoshinkan, which I know other people think Yoshinkan people are the knuckle draggers of Aikido. I've never encountered that I've encountered dicks in Yoshinkan, but I've never encountered that sort of spiritual, sort of overbearing kind of never something
superior kind of thing.
Yeah, that's the word. Yeah. No, I've never really, I have never encountered that in Yoshinkan.
Right.
And I'm not saying that like we're better than everybody else. No, I'm just saying that's not any aspect that I've ever encountered in Yoshinkan.
Well, I think
I kind of forget that aspect exists.
It'd be nice to be able to forget it exists. It's one of those things. And I think that there are in every activity there are dicks. In every activity there are people that feel themselves superior because they do whatever that activity is, or they do it in a way that they think is better than everybody else, or that they have somehow greater level of enlightenment. I guess nowadays the term is virtue signaling, where they can strut around being more virtuous, appearing more virtuous than everybody else. I guess it's gotten fashionable now, sadly, but
very sadly, yes. Yes, the virtue signaling always kills me, but I won't get into that.
Well, exactly, and we won't. But yeah, I think this covers the list, and I wanted to kind of wrap up by thanking everybody who offered their thoughts on what makes Aikido, what traits are specific to Aikido, or that they identify with. I guess there's one I missed on here though. We'll cover real quick, and that is the language and vocabulary, which is I guess like describing a Kotegash or an Ariminage or a Yankyo or something like that. That language is quite specific to Aikido. but I think what it describes are techniques that are pretty much common to other martial arts as well. So although the terminology is unique to Aikido, what they're describing isn't necessarily. Any thoughts on the terminology?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, in Yoshinkan, for example, we say ikajo, nikajo, sankajo, yonkajo. Aikikai is a ikkyo, nikkyo, sankyo, yonkyo, so on and so forth. I believe actually Tomiki even uses different terminology.
Could be, and it's kind of funny. A couple of years ago, I shouldn't say a couple, it's been more than that. A number of years ago, I felt like the Aikido that I was taught came with some terminology that I came to know as normal. And then as I branched out, started looking around more and training with other people, I came across terms I'd never heard before. And I thought, oh man, am I behind the ball in the vocabulary thing? So I started studying up, and then I found the same technique that had like 4 or 5 different names that were radically different. And along the way, I started studying judo that has got a very strict regimented vocabulary. Like they've fleshed it out. There's no ambiguity about, what a technique is named. It doesn't have 2 names. It has 1 name. They did really a great job in terms of the nomenclature, but Aikido didn't have that. And it took me about 2 years, year and a half, 2 years to realize, okay, there's just no way you're going to pin this down to one set of terms that are universal. And I don't speak Japanese, but I did get a little bit of understanding with, for example, I learned the terms irimi and tenkan for entering and turning. And I saw other organizations that used omote ura as the front and behind, which is basically where you go to do your technique. It's the same technique. It's just they use different words to describe getting there, neither of which is inaccurate. Both are valid. But you can't just say we're going to dump one and go with the other one. It's just, that isn't universal. And so I just kind of threw up my hands and just said, okay, I'd like to know the technique, but I'm not going to spend, sleepless nights wondering whether I've got enough vocabulary under my belt. It just isn't worth it.
Well, I found for myself, if I'm talking to people that come from a different system of Aikido than myself, outside of the Yoshinkan world, if they use a term that I'm unfamiliar with, I actually kind of enjoy that, because then it becomes what is that technique? And then we call it, and then sometimes it's kind of fun to then play with the technique and see what their the emphasis points on that system, as opposed to where maybe Yoshinkan would have a different emphasis point on the same technique. And I think that opens up a lot of communication, which is a lot of fun. So I think the diversity in the terminology can lead more towards conversation. I think if you have Koshinage or Seiwainage or Uchimata, and that's universally known as the same technique, I think can have a tendency to maybe limit a certain amount of vocabulary.
Sure.
But if I say, in Yoshinkan we have Ichi or Ni, and then they say, well, in Aikikai, well, what's that? I'm like, well, what do you call it? We do like this or we do like this. Oh, omote ura. And so, and then maybe discussing what's the different points. I think they're for myself, I can't answer for the John Q public. I mean, for myself, it just opens up a lot of communication, and I like that.
Yeah. With the right key, with the right attitude, because I've run across people like, oh, you don't know this term, you must be an idiot, So it can almost use that as a spot, as a tell of where somebody's mind is by when you say, okay, what technique are you what is that term you're talking about? And
and then look at you like, oh, well, you're an idiot, and then it's like, okay, well, yes, first of all, I am. Thank you.
Yeah.
But third, I'll tell this is one of the things that I've talked about with some of my students. I've said, never walk around and be insulted if people underestimate you.
Right.
I said, if they underestimate you, whether it be physically or mentally, they have given you a gift, because they've now put you in a position of power.
Right. That's a good point.
Yeah.
In fact, I can't think of a better point to wrap this up on, because we've been going for an hour and a half.
Oh, wow.
I know, time flies, doesn't it?
It did. Yes.
Oh, that's great. It's kind of funny that you mentioned that, just to wrap up, that back when I was competing, I always loved being underestimated. I loved it when people didn't think me much competition. Because then when you annihilate them, it's like putting a cherry on top of the sundae.
Didn't even see it coming.
It's great, you know. Then you get well known enough that you can't hide behind that anymore. You can't.
Yeah.
They know what's coming, and now it bumps you up a little bit in your level of challenge. But boy, when you have that first time when they say, I got this, and you're like, okay, good deal.
Yeah.
So it's great stuff. But I really enjoyed this discussion. Is there anything you can think to add on before we wrap up?
No, I think I spouted my ignorance enough.
Myself as well. No, thank you for joining me. I was looking forward to this discussion for a while, and like I said on the last podcast, I've been moving. My wife and I moved into a new house, so we've been really scrambling.
Congratulations.
Doing stuff, and yeah, thank you. We're liking it, but still not unpacked everything yet, and things are a little bit slow and going to kind of get back to the pace. But thank you, Reg, for joining me. It's always great to talk to you.
Thanks, Tristan.
You're still in Japan, right? You're not back in California?
I'm still in Japan until 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
So
all right.
I'm currently packing.
Excellent.
Well, an international move sucks.
It does. It really does. You don't realize how much junk you have until you start boxing it up, ready to move it. So,
well, and especially when it's internationally and it costs you big money to like.
Oh, yeah, that can't be good either. Like, wow.
No, it's not good.
Well, yeah. Well, I must say best of luck to you when it comes time to move. Safe travels, and I'm sure we'll talk to you when you're on the other side.
Absolutely.
All right. Take care, my friend.
All right. You too. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Stay tuned for more episodes. I've got some great stuff on the way very soon. In the meantime, enjoy your training.